Good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about face reading, some tidbits from the face reading lineage, and specifically the mouth and the shapes of the lips and what that means in relation to our sexuality, sex drive, and the larger overarching theme of creativity, because sexuality and creativity are pretty closely linked. So at least, I don't know why people just do, but when I was learning about this stuff in my program with Lillian Bridges, my ears perked up. We all want to kind of know about sex and sexuality and what that means for ourselves, for our partners and whatnot. So usually people will be interested in this instinctively on some level. But the thing that I want to talk about first, and the piece that I want to point out, is that when we're just talking about the fullness and thinness of a person's lips. So the disclaimer I always like to give with this stuff is that when we're looking at a face, there aren't any absolutes. So I don't want you guys to think about face reading, if we're looking at this and using this for assessing potential partners, or if we're looking at family members or friends. If you use any of these things, just remember that the stuff I'm sharing with you is always relative to other features on the face, which means that the description I'm going to give for what we would call a sexual mouth, of it's someone who has a strong sexual drive. When we look at that, that doesn't mean that the mouth I describe is going to be true for every single person. They might have other features on the face that actually diminish that, or that accentuate that even more. So it's always in relation to the other aspects and features of the face. That's one thing I want you guys just to keep in mind as I talk about this. So the general idea behind this is that I want to talk about the mouth shape that usually indicates a higher sex drive, or more interest in sexuality, and then from there, what that means and why that's important to understand that, at the physical level, if you're wanting that in a partner, and then also just in terms of what it means for your day-to-day rhythms and how you live your life and what you do and how you wield your creativity, because that's important. We all need to wield it in some way, and if we don't, we get stagnant. So in a nutshell, the simplest overarching tidbit that I can give you here is that typically thinner lips usually mean higher sex drive. So people with thinner lips, where they don't have particularly full lips, where they have slightly thinner across the board, just tighter lips, usually that means an increased sex drive, or usually have a more preoccupation or interest with sexual activity. Now, again, always relative, doesn't mean it's true for everybody, but one of the things that we can look at is that's one of the pieces. Now, things get a little more different, they shift a little bit when we have a thin upper lip and then a slightly fuller lower lip. Now, Lillian Bridges, the way she talks about this, she says, is the fuller the lower lip in relation to a thin upper lip, the more hedonistic the tendencies in the person typically are. So some people that have a lip that where it almost looks like the red portion of the mouth is really, like the moist part is actually showing. They have that sort of like Bubba Gump in Forrest Gump, where they have the more that lip shows and the more that feature is predominant, then we're looking at what she said, very usually large sex drives, large sexual appetites, if that we have a thin upper lip and a full lower one. So again, the recap there is the thin lips in general just means higher sex drive. If you have a thin lip and then a fuller lower lip, then we're looking at, just that higher instinct, urge, and drive towards sexual activity. Now, what I've noticed with people, outside of people wanting to identify, for one, if their partner has a high libido or a medium libido or a low libido, people often want to know this about their partners, especially if they're getting into a relationship, because matching at that frequency is important. If someone has a very high libido and someone has a very low libido, that's going to usually cause some kind of conflict. So it's not about one being better than the other. It's about finding where people link and where they can meet up and be on the same page. That said, the big overarching theme here that I think is really important to acknowledge, outside of seeing if this is true for your face or seeing if this is true in your partner's face or potential partner's faces, is that sexual energy and sexual creativity, those two things, sexuality and creativity, go very closely together. And that's a link you don't want to overlook. So in my mind, the sexual energy and creative energy are pretty interchangeable. Highly creative people often have a higher sexual drive. Now, this isn't always the case, but often this is true. And so what we want to look at is that with a mouth that shows an increased drive towards sexual activity, that doesn't mean that that's the only way to circulate the energy. Someone with very tight lips and they fit the profile of having a high sex drive, what that means is that the creative capacity of the person also needs to be on point, because a lot of people will circulate that energy through sexual activity with their partner. And when they do that, things are better. People feel better. They operate in life better. But if someone is single and say sexual activity is just not on the menu as much as they would like, then what we're looking at is having creative outlets. And that can be dancing, that can be writing, that can be martial arts, that can be yoga, that can be sculpting. There can be a lot of different things, but it's about identifying that if you are a person with a higher sexual drive and this feature of the mouth fits your profile, what you're looking at is that in addition to, getting with a partner who has a similar sex drive, that's important, but then also you really have to have your creative outlets on point so that energy does not back up. One of the key threads that Lillian Bridges brought up when we were talking about this, and Lillian often talks about sexuality and talks about how it relates to fertility, the facial features, that is. And one of the things that she brought up and that she said was, if you look at a lot of serial killers, and this is sort of a morbid example, but it's accurate. She said a lot of serial killers, people that have these really violent urges, usually have some kind of very deep-seated repressed sexual trauma. And that doesn't mean everybody that has sexual trauma is going to become a serial killer. But she said that she had, in looking over the years and looking at people's faces, that was one of the threads that she found interesting when she was looking at, people that were imbalanced human beings that were dangerous to the culture and population. Was just that if you bottle that energy or you suppress it or it gets damaged, that energy, which actually creates life, the sexual creativity in a nutshell, right? The sexual act that actually creates life, if that gets damaged, traumatized, or suppressed, it does the opposite. If you suppress that life force and that sexual energy gets bottled, it can lash out sometimes in violent ways. And this is why a lot of boxers and fighters, they would say, they would encourage them, don't engage in sexual activity before a fight, because it would sort of drop that killer instinct out of the body. And those are sort of like old wives' tales, in our culture, but it was pretty consistent. There were a lot of trainers that were of that mind, because having some sexual energy backed up made you a little more tense, probably a little more aggressive. And so these are just ideas to keep in mind when we're looking at this, when you're looking at other people's face. Now, the other piece about the mouth, the other side of this coin, is that when a person has full lips, very full lips, top and bottom, that doesn't mean that person can't have a high sexual appetite. Like I said, other features can sort of bring out more sexual energy in terms of just reading a face. But the thing to remember about full-lipped people, usually these are people that are sensual. And what that means is that of the senses, right, the five senses, but specifically they like engaging in the sensory experience of life. They like good smells. They like soft textures. They like the sensual sensory experience of life and living. And so obviously those things can definitely fall into the sexual spectrum, but the other piece of this, right, outside of the thin-lipped people who have the higher sex drive, oftentimes there can be this factor of just being sensual. And that's important to understand in your partner. If your partner likes the sensory experience of life, that's a really important thing to take into account in terms of your dynamics in the bedroom, and then also just your dynamics in day-to-day living. If your partner likes those things, it's a good thing to identify and to notice and to hopefully nourish and support. It's not a bad thing at all. So the only caveat with this is that what Lillian has told me is that people that have a thinner lower lip and a larger upper lip, she says these are people that are prone to a little bit of drama. They can be drama queens or kings, either way. But that's one of the things to just kind of check in and search for in potential partners, friends, family, just kind of seeing where people are. Again, none of this stuff is absolute, it's always relative. But if you consider these things and you look at your own face and you look at other people's faces, what this should give you, ideally, and my hope is that you can understand yourself a little bit better, have these tools in place to understand that you have potentially, if you have a thin lips and you by the book have like the sexual marker, If you don't have a high sex drive, you likely have a high creative drive, and you should use that. And if you do fit the profile and you have a high sex drive and are interested in and have the urge for sexual activity, you also need to have that creative piece online. You can't separate sexual energy and creative energy, and that's really what the bigger point is here, is identifying is that if you have this marker and it fits for you, you really need to be on point with your creative endeavors. It's not something you want to let slide. So hope this finds you guys well. If you have any questions, always feel free to hit me up. And if anyone is interested in getting a face reading and getting a 75-minute session with me, I'm always available, because these tools, like I said, this is just one feature of the face, but they can be really helpful in terms of navigating life and understanding yourself, your social circles, and your relationships. Take care.